Imagine for a second that you are holding a magnifying glass right up to the fabric of reality. You zoom in on a fire burning a piece of wood.
Right.
And, science tells us all about combustion, right? About oxygen, about thermal energy. It feels entirely predictable, almost mechanical.
Yeah, we totally take that for granted. It's just physics.
Exactly. But what if the fire isn't actually causing the wood to burn at all?
Oh, wow. Okay.
What if cause and effect is like a complete illusion, a literal trick played on our minds, and every single spark, every single crackle of that wood is being actively, individually willed into existence, frame by frame, by a higher power in that exact millisecond?
I mean, that completely shatters our fundamental reliance on the laws of physics.
Right.
It makes the universe infinitely more mysterious and arguably much more terrifying.
Yeah, terrifying is a good word for it.
And that very question, whether the universe is a predictable mechanical clock or a continuous momentary act of divine willpower, well, that isn't a product of modern quantum physics or like simulated reality theories.
No, it absolutely isn't. We are heading far, far beyond our modern laboratories today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are jumping straight back into the 8th century Islamic world. Specifically, we're talking about the massive intellectual boom centered in places like Basra and Baghdad.
Which is just a fascinating period.
It really is. And we have a phenomenal stack of source material today. We're looking at excerpts from a really dense, deeply researched text detailing the rise and fall of rationalism in Islam.
A very heavy read, but so worth it.
Oh, completely. Our mission today is to unpack this massive, centuries-long clash between hardcore rationalism and the fierce orthodox reaction that followed it. We're going to explore how early thinkers debated quantum-like atomism, the illusion of reality, and the nature of God.
And they did this centuries before European philosophers ever even touched these concepts.
Exactly. So to really grasp the magnitude of these debates, we have to look at the political and cultural earthquake that was happening at the time, right?
Yeah, we really do. We are stepping into the era of the Abbasid dynasty. So the previous ruling power, the Umayyads, had just been overthrown.
Right, and they were very Arab-centric, correct?
Yes, very Arab-centric in their administration. But with the rise of the Abbasids, the center of gravity shifts entirely.
Okay.
The source text points out a really fascinating phenomenon regarding what it calls the Persian mind. After adjusting to these new political realities, the Persian intellect basically reasserts its innate freedom.
It kind of wakes up again.
Yeah, it begins to step back from the pure objective expansion of the empire and turns inward.
So it's a moment of profound cultural introspection.
Exactly. And it's not happening in a vacuum either. You have this massive translation movement happening simultaneously.
Right, they were translating everything they could get their hands on.
The translation of Greek philosophy is literally the fuel poured onto this intellectual fire. The spirit of the people begins to realize itself as the ultimate arbiter of truth.
Which is a huge shift.
Massive. Subjectivity rises up to challenge outward traditional authority. And the epicenter of this entire movement is the city of Basra.
Basra. Okay, paint a picture of Basra for us.
Well, because of its location and its commercial power, Basra became this incredibly chaotic playground of various forces.
Like a melting pot.
Exactly. You had Greek thought colliding with Christianity, you had Buddhist ideas floating in along the trade routes, and older Persian belief systems like Manichaeism.
Manichaeism, which is that deeply dualistic religion, right? The one pitting light against dark.
Yes, exactly. Light versus dark, good versus evil. All of this is commingling in the streets and the academies.
So Basra basically sounds like the Silicon Valley of 8th century philosophy.
That is a perfect analogy.
You have all these brilliant competing minds trapped in an incubator, and every major world idea is just cross-pollinating.
Right. Everyone is trying to figure out the ultimate truth.
And people are trying to reconcile the pure, cold logic of Aristotle with the fiery, immediate revelation of the Quran.
And out of that collision, a movement explodes onto the scene. Mutazilism, Islamic Rationalism.
Okay, let's get into the rationalists. Where do they start?
So it's initiated in the first half of the 8th century by a Persian thinker named Wasil ibn Atta. The Mutazila had a very specific, highly ambitious goal.
Which was?
They wanted to critically examine Islamic monotheism using the newly discovered tools of Greek logic.
So they're bringing math and logic to religion.
Yes. They weren't trying to destroy religion, though. That's a key point. They were trying to bulletproof it.
Okay.
They wanted to build a perfectly consistent theory of the universe, entirely grounded in reason. To defend their faith, against the sophisticated arguments of Christian theologians and Manichaean dualists they were constantly encountering in places like Basra.
But I mean, applying cold geometric logic to the concept of God creates some immediate massive problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. The source material spends a lot of time on how these rationalists ended up formulating what we might call the uncomfortable unity of God.
The uncomfortable unity, I like that phrase. Because the orthodox view of God was fairly straightforward and comforting to the average believer, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. God has attributes. God has knowledge. God has power. God has life. God has a will. It's very relatable.
Right. But I can see the logical trap forming already. If you are a hardcore rationalist and you say God has knowledge, you've suddenly separated God from his knowledge.
Exactly. You've created two things.
Right. You have God, and then you have this separate thing called knowledge that God possesses.
And if that knowledge is eternal, as God is eternal, you now have multiple eternal things.
Which is a huge problem.
Huge! To the rationalists, that borders on polytheism. It introduces plurality into the divine.
So how do they fix it?
Well, a prominent rationalist thinker named Abul Hudhail stepped in to solve this. He argued for absolute identity,
Meaning what?
meaning God's knowledge, power, and life do not exist separately from him as attributes. They literally are his essence.
Oh, okay. So God doesn't possess knowledge, God is knowledge.
You nailed it, which solves the plurality problem.
But logic is a relentless machine. Once you start it, it doesn't stop. I'm guessing the next generation pushed it further.
Much further. Thinkers like Muammar and Abu Hashim looked at Abul Hudhail's solution and found a fatal flaw in it.
Of course they did.
They argued that you can't even predicate knowledge of God, even as an identity. Think about the nature of knowledge itself. If there is knowledge, there must be an object of that knowledge. You have to know something.
Right, you can't just have floating knowledge. So if God knows the universe, that implies duality again, the knower and the known.
Yes, exactly. And if you argue that God only has knowledge of himself, it creates this absurd logical loop. It forces an identity of subject and object that their strict logical framework just couldn't support.
Wow, so they're literally logicking themselves into a corner.
They really are. They concluded that to protect the absolute indivisible unity of God, you have to strip away all conceivable attributes.
All of them.
All of them. God becomes a mere abstract possibility. According to their ultimate logical deduction, absolutely nothing can be definitively said about God without compromising his unity.
That is wild. The text highlights a massive irony here, and I think it's important to point out.
Yeah, absolutely.
By trying to save the concept of God through rigorous logic, they essentially logic themselves into erasing the personal God of religion entirely.
Yeah, they really did.
Because, I mean, if God has no distinct traits, no will you can describe, and no knowledge you can define, you are left with an equation, not a creator.
That's spot on. The source text points out that in this relentless effort to internalize the rigid externality of absolute law, the rationalists unconsciously touched the outer fringe of pantheism.
Pantheism. So God is everything and nothing at the same time.
Pretty much. They formulated a God so abstract, so entirely devoid of relatable qualities, that he effectively becomes the universe itself, a pure, distant, abstract principle, rather than a being you could pray to or seek guidance from.
That sounds incredibly alienating.
It was. But they didn't stop at theology. They applied this exact same relentless logic to the physical world, to the dirt, the water, the stars.
And that's where we get their physics.
Right. They developed an incredibly intricate system of Islamic atomism and naturalism. Their explanation of matter is arguably their most significant contribution to metaphysical speculation.
Okay, let's break that down. Why were they so obsessed with matter?
Well, the rationalists desperately wanted to exclude all arbitrariness from nature. They wanted a predictable universe governed by observable rules, much like the Greek philosophers they were studying.
But they don't want a universe where miracles just break the rules all the time.
Exactly. So a thinker named Nizam taught the infinite divisibility of matter. And in doing so, he obliterated the distinction between substance and accident.
Oh, wait, we should definitely break those terms down, because substance and accident are crucial to how people viewed the world back then.
Good call. So in classical philosophy, a substance is the core thing itself, like an apple.
Right, the apple is the substance.
And an accident is a temporary quality that belongs to the substance, like the apple's red color or its sweetness. The redness can't exist on its own without the apple.
Okay, makes sense. And orthodox thought held that God created both the substance and its accidents.
Exactly. But Nazam looks at this and essentially argues what modern philosophers might call bundle theory. He says there is no underlying invisible apple substance.
Wait, really? So what is the apple?
An apple is just a collection of material potentialities,
Mhm.
its taste, its odor, its color. That's it. There's no hidden core.
Okay, and this seemingly small shift in understanding matter leads to a monumental concept introduced by another thinker, Bishr ibn al-Mutamir,
Yes, the concept of tawalud.
Tawalud,
Right.
which deals with the interaction of bodies, right?
Exactly, and tawalud entirely redefines causality in the Islamic world.
Because in the traditional orthodox view, if I throw a stone up into the air and it falls back to the ground, it falls because God is actively willing it to fall in that very moment.
Right, God's hand is directly involved in every single movement in the universe.
But the rationalists didn't like that.
They found that idea intellectually unsatisfying and philosophically messy. Bishr ibn al-Mutamir and the proponents of tawalud argue that things have inherent properties.
So the stone falls because of its own indwelling property.
Exactly, a physical nature that dictates its behavior.
I love the analogy for this. It's basically the difference between a puppet master and a computer programmer.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right, because the orthodox view sees God as the puppet master. He's actively holding the strings, pulling the rock to the ground, sparking the fire every single time a piece of flint is struck.
Constant intervention.
Yeah, but the rationalists are arguing that God is more like a master software engineer. He wrote the code, he created the physics engine, he gave the atoms their inherent properties and rules of engagement, and then he just hit run.
Yes. The software executes on its own internal logic. The rock falls because the code says it must fall.
It's so modern. But the text notes the massive theological implication of this.
It does. Because of this view, the rationalists were, as the source describes, philosophically materialists and theologically deists.
Which means they absolutely believed in a creator, but they built a clockwork universe.
Right. God designed the machine, but the machine now runs on its own power.
But history shows us over and over again that when you make the universe too mechanical, when you strip away the mystery and tell everyday people that God is just a distant programmer.
People don't like that.
No, they don't. Reality becomes just a cold, logical equation. A deep sense of alienation sets in. People want a connection to the divine, not just a mathematical proof of its existence.
Exactly. When logic leaves people cold, they go looking for alternatives.
And the source outlines 3 major counter-movements, or sidesteps, that rose up as a direct reaction to this dry abstraction of rationalism.
Yeah. The first was a turn toward sheer skepticism.
Which makes sense. Just give up on the whole project.
Right. Thinkers like Al-Jahiz, who was technically raised in the rationalist camp, started reacting violently against the endless metaphysical hair-splitting of his peers.
He was just tired of it.
Completely. He leaned into a sort of deistic naturalism, distancing himself from the theological debates entirely.
And then the second movement went in the complete opposite direction. Sufism.
Yes. Systematized early on by figures like Dhul Nun, Sufism was a direct appeal to a higher, emotional, and intuitive source of knowledge.
So they completely bypassed the math and the logic.
Exactly. If the intellect of the rationalists was a dry, desolate desert, Sufism offered the oasis of direct, deeply personal spiritual experience. They argued that you can't logic your way to God, you have to feel him.
Which is super appealing if you've just been handed a clockwork universe. But the third alternative the text explores is where the history gets wildly complicated.
Oh yeah, the Ismailian movement.
This part is fascinating. The source describes it as a characteristically Persian movement that somehow manages to blend Greek philosophy, Christianity, rationalism, Sufism, Manichaeism, and even concepts of reincarnation into a single, cohesive worldview.
It's quite the ideological cocktail. The Ismailians represent what the text calls a revival of authority. This movement was essentially an intellectual and political battle waged by the independent Persian mind against the dominant Arab power structure.
So it was political and philosophical.
Very much so. A brilliant figure named Abdullah ibn Maimun is credited with weaving all these disparate philosophies together, and he did this under the pious cloak of the doctrine of imamat.
The doctrine of imamat, which is the belief in a divine, infallible authority figure who guides the community, right?
Yes, exactly. But we need to pause here and address a major historical misconception the text points out.
Oh, yes. This is crucial because When many modern readers, especially in the West, hear the word Ismailian, their minds immediately jump to the legends of the Hashashin.
Right, the assassins.
Yeah, they picture this shadowy, secret clique of dark murderers operating out of mountain fortresses.
But the source text mounts a very careful, impartial defense against dismissing the Ismailians as a mere murderous cult.
And we want to be very clear, we are just presenting the source's historical argument here.
Exactly. The author asks for historical empathy. Yes, the movement was connected to political violence and assassinations. However, the text argues that in that specific era, assassinations for religious or political purposes were often considered standard practice.
Right, they were almost unobjectionable by the moral standards of the day.
Yeah. The author draws a sharp parallel to European history to make the point, mentioning how centuries later, the Pope in Rome literally approved of the horrific St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France.
Right, so the argument is twofold. First, it is historically unjust to judge the political tactics of the 8th and 9th centuries by modern standards of human rights.
And second, and far more importantly for our deep dive today, a movement that shook a vast empire to its absolute foundations and stood for centuries as a formidable champion of science and philosophy.
It simply could not have rested entirely on the frail, shallow basis of a political conspiracy.
Exactly. There had to be immense intellectual gravity and philosophical substance to sustain it for that long.
And that profound substance is found in their cosmology. They looked at the rationalist idea of a distant, abstract God, and instead of just accepting the clockwork universe, they built a massive, mystical architecture around it.
It really did. The text details their emanation theory.
Walk us through that. How does the emanation theory work?
It functions kind of like a cosmic waterfall of creation. They start at the very top with the primal unity. This is God, who's entirely incomprehensible, totally beyond all human attributes or logic.
Okay, so far, similar to the rationalist abstract God.
Right. But then this primal unity emanates or transforms itself into the first intellect, which they call universal reason.
So from pure, unknowable unity comes the first spark of structured thought.
Yes. The first intellect then creates the universal soul. But here is the critical turning point in their philosophy.
What happened?
The universal soul feels a lack. It recognizes its separation from the primal unity and experiences a deep, driving desire to return to that original source.
It wants to go home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to achieve this return, it feels the necessity of motion, of action. And so the universal soul creates the physical universe, the heavens, the elements, the visible world we live in.
Okay, I love this framing. The physical universe is basically born out of the soul's homesickness.
It really is.
It is essentially an elaborate cosmic escape room. The universe doesn't exist just to exist. It is a gymnasium, a testing ground designed solely for the progressive education of the soul.
Yes, the cosmic escape room. I like that. The individual human soul is viewed as a miniature replica of the entire universe, existing within this physical realm strictly for this progressive education.
It has to level up.
Right. It has to learn, adapt, and evolve to find its way back. And the universal reason incarnates from time to time in a physical leader, or imam, to guide these lost souls through this confusing scene of plurality and matter, pointing them back toward eternal unity.
And what happens when the escape room is finally beaten?
Well, when the universal soul finally reaches its goal of returning to the source, the physical universe has served its purpose and disintegrates.
It just ends.
Yeah. The particles of goodness return to truth and unity in God. The particles of evil, which represent the stubborn attachment to the physical world, go to untruth and diversity, which they symbolize as the devil.
It is a staggering, beautiful way to view reality.
It really is.
But, while the Ismailians are building these mystical escape rooms and the rationalists are defending their clockwork physics, the orthodox religious establishment is watching all of this with growing horror.
Oh, they were terrified. The solidarity of the Islamic community was fracturing. The pure reliance on Greek logic was threatening to dismantle the foundations of divine revelation.
And this sets the stage for a massive intellectual counteroffensive, the Asharite reaction.
Yes. And to mount a successful counteroffensive, you need a general who intimately knows the enemy's tactics.
Enter al-Ashari.
Enter al-Ashari, born in 873 AD.
Yeah.
His backstory is fascinating because he wasn't an orthodox outsider, just lobbing critiques over the wall at the rationalists.
He was on the inside.
He was one of them. He was a star pupil of a very prominent rationalist teacher named al-Jubai.
So he knew the math. He knew the Greek logic inside and out.
He had mastered the dialectic, But eventually, a deep intellectual and spiritual crisis caused him to turn against his teacher.
Wow. A
A
betrayal.
philosophical one, yeah.
That.
He took the exact same logical methods and dialectical tools the rationalists had spent a century perfecting, and he used them to systematically demolish their own philosophical house.
So the Asherite movement wasn't an anti-intellectual purge?
Not at all. It was a highly sophisticated attempt to harmonize religious consciousness with rigorous thought. They basically weaponized the dialectic method to defend divine revelation.
And the way they tackled the debate over free will is a perfect example of the subtle maneuvering.
It's brilliant.
Because the older Orthodox schools were often extremely fatalistic, right? God dictates everything. Humanity has zero agency. You are essentially a leaf blown by the wind of divine decree.
Right. And the rationalists, defending God's justice, went to the other extreme. They said humanity has total, absolute free will to choose good or evil. Otherwise, God couldn't fairly judge us.
So how does al-Ash'ari thread the needle?
He taught that God creates both the power of choice and the actual human action itself. However, man is given the power of acquiring these different modes of activity. It's known as the doctrine of cause or acquisition.
So God provides the metaphysical energy for the action, but the human consciousness acquires the moral responsibility by aligning its will with the action as it happens.
Exactly. It's incredibly nuanced.
But where the Ash'arites really leave their mark on history, and this brings us back to the burning wood analogy from the beginning, is their physics.
Yes. This is the mind-bending part.
They looked at the rationalist idea of causality, the idea that a rock falls because it has its own inherent properties, and they realized how dangerous that idea was to their faith.
The Ash'arites recognized that if they accepted a universe governed by unbreakable, inherent natural laws, they would have to surrender the possibility of miracles.
Right. Because if fire always burns cotton strictly because of the inherent unchanging chemical nature of fire and cotton,
Then a miracle like Moses parting the Red Sea or Abraham surviving being thrown into a furnace is a literal impossibility. It's a violation of reality itself.
so rather than give up miracles, the Ash'arites make one of the most audacious intellectual leaps in human history.
They reject the universal law of causation entirely.
It is a doctrine called occasionalism. Let's really map out the mechanics of occasionalism because it's wild.
So they boldly taught that the idea of power existing in a physical object is fundamentally meaningless. We observe the world, but we know nothing but floating impressions.
Pillaging impressions.
Yeah, the fact that fire burns Kati is not a law of nature. It is merely a habit.
A habit.
The phenomenal order of these impressions, the sequence of events, is determined entirely and completely, moment to moment, by the direct will of God.
Okay, let's use the analogy from earlier. It's like a stop-motion animation film.
Perfect analogy.
If you watch a claymation movie, it looks like the character is smoothly moving their arm to pick up a cup.
Yeah.
But we know that the frame of the film we are currently looking at has zero causal power over the next frame.
Right, the first frame doesn't cause the second frame.
There is an animator outside the film who is manually swapping out the frames, moving the clay millimeter by millimeter so incredibly fast that our brains are tricked into seeing continuous motion and cause and effect.
And in the Asherite system, God is the animator. When fire touches cotton, the fire does not cause the cotton to blacken and turn to ash.
Then what happens?
God creates the fire in one frame. God creates the cotton in the same frame. And at the exact moment they touch, God actively creates the burning in the next frame. God literally destroys and recreates the entire universe in every single atomic instant to maintain the illusion of continuity.
The sheer scale of that theological vision is exhausting to even think about.
He really is.
I mean, God has to actively, consciously will my heart to beat blood cell by blood cell every single second. There is no inertia.
Nope, none.
If God pauses his active creation for a microsecond, the entire universe simply vanishes into nothingness.
And the source text makes some incredible comparisons to Western philosophy here, showing just how far ahead of their time the Asherites were.
Oh, right. Berkeley and Kant.
Yeah. By arguing that physical objects have no inherent power and that reality is sustained purely by divine will, the Asherites reduced the universe to a mere show of ordered subjectivities. Centuries later, in the 1700s, the Irish philosopher George Berkeley would formulate a remarkably similar concept.
Subjective idealism.
Exactly. Arguing that physical objects only exist as perceptions in a mind, and the universe is ultimately sustained by the mind of God.
To be is to be perceived.
Precisely. The text also draws a line to Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that human knowledge is strictly limited by our perceptions. We can only know phenomena, stopping at the unknowable thing in itself, or the noumenal world.
But the Asherites went even further than Kant.
They did. They endeavored to penetrate beyond that limit, reducing external reality entirely to ideality in order to save the absolute unmediated power of the primal being.
They sacrificed the laws of physics to save the omnipotence of God.
That's a great way to put it.
But a system this intense, this radically dependent on subjective perception, inevitably leads to an epistemological crisis.
Oh, for sure.
Because if everything is just a moment-to-moment presentation, how can we know anything for certain? This crisis peaks with one of the most towering figures in the history of Islamic thought, Al-Ghazali.
Yes. Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111 AD, is the ultimate skeptic of this entire era. The source text drops a stunning historical fact about him.
Like, yes.
Al-Ghazali anticipated René Descartes' method of radical doubt, and he cut the bond of causality 700 years before the Scottish philosopher David Hume famously did the same in Europe.
That is insane. How does a deeply religious scholar arrive at radical skepticism?
Well, the text explains that it started with a profound crisis of authority early in his life. Al-Ghazali is quoted directly in the text, revealing that from childhood he harbored a deep intellectual revolt against relying on authority for truth.
So he just didn't trust what he was told.
Not at all. He looked around his society and realized a glaring problem. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all fiercely held their respective beliefs based almost entirely on the authority of their parents and teachers.
Right. The beliefs were inherited, not logically deduced.
To Al-Ghazali, this was entirely arbitrary. He realized that if he had been born to different parents, he would hold a completely different set of absolute truths.
Which is a terrifying realization if you're trying to find objective truth.
Right, so he decides to tear everything down to the studs. He demands a foundation of real knowledge that eradicates all doubt whatsoever. He demands mathematical certainty in theology.
And he has a great thought experiment for this standard of truth, right? The stick and the snake.
Yes, it's brilliant. He says, imagine a man claims to be a prophet and says, to prove that 3 is greater than 10, I will turn this stick into a snake.
Okay.
The man throws the stick down, and it genuinely becomes a living snake right in front of your eyes. Al-Ghazali says, the magic trick is astounding, and it might inspire awe, but it does absolutely nothing to change the fundamental certainty of mathematics.
Right, because 3 is still not greater than 10.
Exactly. The logical truth that 10 is greater than 3 remains unshaken, regardless of the miracle. He wanted a theology built on that level of unshakable certainty.
So he takes this relentless skeptical blade and he starts cutting.
Just slicing through everything.
He dissects the pure Greek philosophy of the Aristotelians. He dissects the complex theology of the rationalists. He even applies it to the Asherite system he belonged to.
And he finds all of them fundamentally lacking.
Oh, so?
He exposes the fact that all of these grand logical systems eventually rely on unprovable first principles. He found intellectualism to be, in his words, a desolate sand.
A desolate sand.
Logic is a closed loop. It can organize information brilliantly, but it cannot independently generate absolute certainty about the divine. It cannot prove the ultimate reality of God to the satisfaction of a soul demanding absolute truth.
So the greatest logical mind of his generation hits the absolute limit of logic. Where do you go from there?
The text details his pivot. He turns away from the desolate sand of intellectualism and immerses himself entirely in Sufism.
Okay, so he goes mystical.
He moves from the realm of the mind to the realm of the spirit. His positive, constructive contribution to Islamic thought after this crisis is beautifully captured in his work Mishkat al-Anwar, where he explores his philosophy of light.
Let's talk about the philosophy of light. He takes a single famous verse from the Quran, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, and he extrapolates an entire comprehensive philosophical framework from it.
He does. For Al-Ghazali, light is not just a metaphor. It is the only real existence. Absolute light is God.
So what is darkness?
Darkness, by contrast, is not an opposing force. It is simply non-existence. The bodies and objects in the physical world are differentiated purely by how much of this divine light they manage to receive and reflect.
But the core of his solution lies in how human beings perceive this light, right? He makes a sharp distinction between the physical eye and the internal eye.
Yes. The physical eye, bounded by the material world, can only see the external manifestation of light. It sees the photons bouncing off a wall. It is limited, easily tricked, and ultimately finite.
But the internal eye is different.
Very different. Al-Ghazali argues there is an internal eye situated in the heart of humanity. This internal spiritual eye is not bound by the physical laws of nature. It can pierce through the dense veil of physical manifestation and apprehend the absolute light directly.
It's an incredible resolution to his skepticism. He is essentially saying that you cannot logic your way to God because logic is a tool of the finite mind. To understand the infinite, you have to bypass the mind and experience God directly through this internal mystical intuition.
However, the source text is careful to note a lingering tension in al-Ghazali's synthesis.
Well, there's always a tension.
The rigid monotheism of the Ash'arites made it incredibly dangerous to deeply discuss the exact nature of the human soul. Because if the human soul is immaterial, and God is immaterial, the logic threatens to sweep away all difference between the creator and the created.
Oh, wow. You end up right back at pantheism, the exact thing the rationalists accidentally stumbled into centuries earlier.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali was brilliant enough to see the pantheistic drift of his own internal logic. Realizing the danger, he actively preferred silence on the ultimate nature of the soul in his public writings.
So he just didn't write about it.
He kept the deepest secrets of his private reflections confined to a small circle of his most trusted disciples.
He saw where the math was inevitably leading, and he deliberately chose to put the chalk down. It's a profound moment of intellectual restraint.
It really is.
But while al-Ghazali found peace in mysticism, the academic war waged on. The final section of our source material zooms out to detail a massive, highly technical intellectual conflict. The grand debate between idealism and realism.
This is where things get super dense. In one camp, you have the Ash'arites, championing idealism. In the opposing camp, you have the followers of Aristotle, the realists, championed by later thinkers like al-Khatib.
And the battleground for this debate is one of the most foundational questions in all of philosophy, the nature of essence versus existence.
Yeah, this requires some immense logical rigor to break down.
So let's break it down carefully. What exactly is the Asharite or idealist view of essence and existence?
So the Ash'arites are driven by their absolute commitment to God as the sole creator and sustainer of every moment, right?
Occasionalism, stop-motion reality.
Exactly. Therefore, they held that individual essences are determined entirely by the ultimate cause. To an Asharite, essence and existence are identical. You cannot separate them.
Meaning there isn't like a blueprint waiting to be built?
Right. There is no invisible underlying stuff of reality waiting around to be given life. God determines existence, and that act of existing constitutes the very being, the essence of the thing itself.
Okay, contrast that with the realists, the Aristotelians.
The realists maintained a fundamental separation. They argued that existence is an attribute that is superadded to an underlying uncaused essence.
Superadded, okay.
In their view, there's a primary substance, a theoretical essence common to things, and actual existence is merely a quality layered on top of it by a cause.
The source text provides a fascinating, highly technical critique of the realist position by a thinker named Ibn Mubarak. Let's walk through his logic, because it exposes a massive flaw in the Aristotelian model.
Oh, Ibn Mubarak launches a devastating logical attack. He asks the realists, if you claim existence is just a quality or an attribute added to an essence, what was the state of that essence before it received existence?
It's a brilliant trap, because if the essence didn't exist yet, it was nothing.
Exactly the point he makes. You cannot logically say the essence was ready to receive existence before it actually existed. Having the property of readiness implies that it already possessed some form of reality.
Right, readiness is a state of being.
It implies it was in a state of non-existence, which makes no sense. You can't paint a house that hasn't been built yet. An attribute needs a subject to attach to.
So if the essence doesn't exist, it can't receive the attribute of existence.
Boom. Ibn Mubarak exposes the sheer logical absurdity of treating existence as an external attribute added to a pre-existing void.
But the source material remains remarkably objective here, because having dismantled the realist argument, it turns around and exposes the deep flaws in the Asharite idealist argument as well.
Yeah, it points out that both sides were operating on deeply flawed theories of knowledge.
Okay, what's wrong with the realists first?
The agnostic realist is guilty of a glaring contradiction. They claim that behind all the phenomenal qualities of a thing, the color, the weight, the shape, there is an underlying, fundamentally unknowable essence operating as their true cause.
Unknowable is the key word there.
Right. But the text points out the hypocrisy. If this essence is truly unknowable, how can the realist claim to know that it exists in the first place? They are simultaneously claiming absolute knowledge of the unknowable.
Oh, that's a great point. And the Asharite idealist falls into an equally dangerous trap on the other side of the spectrum.
The Asharites entirely ignore the active mental processing of the human mind. Because they view every single event in the universe as a direct, momentary creation of God, they look upon human perceptions as mere presentations determined entirely by the divine.
They reduce human consciousness to a completely passive receiver of God's continuous slideshow.
Yes. And if you follow that idealist logic to its absolute terminus, it leads to a terrifying, lonely conclusion.
Yeah, I realized this while reading the text, and it blew my mind. If everything I experience is just a sensory presentation fed directly into my mind by God, if there is no independent, external, material reality, then what about the people around me?
Yep, there it is.
The unavoidable implication is that my friends, my family, every human being I interact with has no higher reality than a mere state of my own consciousness. It leads to absolute, inescapable solipsism.
Exactly. I am the only mind that exists, sitting alone in a void, watching a cosmic movie projected by God.
That is so bleak.
The text notes that this is the exact, fatal critique leveled against extreme idealism. If human knowledge is nothing more than a passive receptivity of divine presentations, it sweeps away all possibility of human error, sure, but it isolates the individual entirely. The universe dissolves into a single, lonely mind.
As if this wasn't complex enough, there is one final, bizarre theological puzzle they debated that we must touch on. It's the debate over the nature of non-existence.
Oh, this one is a brain breaker.
Yeah.
And it all stems from trying to logically explain the religious dogma of the resurrection.
Because the theological problem is profound. How does God bring back the dead who have physically rotted away and literally no longer exist?
Right. To solve this, the Asherites ended up arguing a seemingly paradoxical concept. They argued that non-existence is something.
They argued that nothing is actually something. How do they justify that logically?
They approached it through the lens of human cognition. They argued that because the human mind can conceptualize, make judgments about, and discuss the non-existent must therefore be known. And the mere fact of its knowability logically indicates that nothing is not absolutely, utterly nothing. It must possess some shadowy form of reality in order to be an object of thought.
It's like arguing about a golden mountain, right? A mountain made of solid gold doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. But I can perfectly describe it to you, you can picture it in your mind, and we can debate its hypothetical weight.
I get it.
Therefore, the concept of the golden mountain has a real existence in our minds, even if it lacks physical reality.
The realist champion, Al-Khatib, vehemently argued against this conceptual leap. He countered that just because the human mind can construct and know about impossible or non-existent things, that does not mean those things possess any external objective reality.
And he famously applies this strict logical division to the concept of evil.
Yes, the philosophers maintain that the existent is inherently good and the non-existent is evil. Al-Khatib argues that evil is fundamentally an absence, a non-existential condition.
Like blindness.
Exactly. Blindness is not a positive substance. It is the absence of sight. A murder is evil not because the physical metal of the knife is evil, but because the act is the ultimate negation of life.
Evil is a void.
But again, the debate hits a wall. Al-Khatib ultimately rejects the idea that human beings can definitively prove these massive metaphysical concepts through incomplete induction.
The debate just spirals. A perfect storm of brilliant logic endlessly trying to map the unmappable boundaries of reality.
That's a poetic way to summarize it.
This has been an incredibly dense, rewarding journey. We started with the Metaphysics rationalists who trusted logic so deeply they tried to define God perfectly, nearly erasing him into an abstract equation, while simultaneously building a mechanical universe of atoms running on their own internal software.
Right, the clockwork universe.
Then we watched the Ismailians reject that cold mechanics to build a massive cosmic escape room where the universal soul painfully educates itself through the physical universe to return to the primal unity.
And then we witnessed the staggering Asherite counteroffensive, sweeping away the very laws of cause and effect to preserve God's absolute unmediated power, reducing all of reality to a divine, moment-to-moment, stop-motion film.
And finally, we saw Al-Ghazali, the ultimate skeptic, realize that all this logic, all this brilliant metaphysical hair-splitting ultimately leads to a desolate sand. He concluded that the only true way forward is the internal eye, the direct mystical apprehension of the light.
It's just a spectacular arc of human thought. And the reason this history remains so vital today is that these aren't dead, ancient arguments. We are still grappling with these exact same boundaries.
We really are.
When modern physicists debate quantum mechanics and the role of the conscious observer in collapsing the wave function, or when tech philosophers debate whether artificial intelligence can truly possess consciousness.
We are echoing the halls of 8th century Basra.
Exactly. We are continually asking, what can science and pure reason definitively prove? What is the true nature of cause and effect? And at what point does the measurable universe end, forcing us to rely on intuition, emotion, or faith?
The intellectual X-ray machine we use to examine reality is immensely powerful, but it clearly has defined limits. And that brings us to a final thought I want you to mull over today.
I'm ready for it.
Take the Asherite concept of occasionalism, the idea that cause and effect is an illusion, merely a habit of our minds trying to make sense of a universe actually controlled, frame by frame, by an active higher power.
Right, the stop-motion film.
Tomorrow morning, when you accidentally drop your keys or your pen and you watch it fall and hit the floor, take a second. Ask yourself, are you actually observing a fundamental, unbreakable physical law of gravity at work? Or are you simply seeing a pattern you've been deeply conditioned to expect? Are you witnessing physics or just a habit of your own mind? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. What if I told you that the cure for your modern smartphone burnout, or the political shouting matches on your timeline, and just your general exhaustion with the 21st century was actually invented by a group of rebellious Persian mystics in the 8th century?
That is quite the claim to start with.
Right. But you look at the world today, and it is just so incredibly easy to feel like we're living in the most overwhelming time in human history. I mean, we wake up, we look at our screens, and we are instantly hit with a wall of noise.
Oh, absolutely. It's constant.
Yeah, we're digesting global political unrest, watching strangers scream at each other over, dogmatic arguments, and we're just drowning in information overload. It feels uniquely modern.
Yeah.
Like this is a brand new kind of pressure cooker that only we in the digital age have had to figure out how to survive.
Well, it is a very common trap we fall into. There's actually a term for it. It's called chronocentrism.
Chronocentrism, okay.
Yeah, it's the deeply held, almost arrogant belief that our current era is the ultimate apex of complexity, and that people in the past just lived these simple, linear, quiet lives. But the reality of human history is that societal burnout is not a new phenomenon at all.
And that is exactly what blew my mind when I started reading the source material for today's deep dive. Because
Yeah.
if you have ever felt that specific type of modern exhaustion, that deep, aching desire to just unplug from the shouting and find some kind of quiet internal truth, you are sharing the exact same psychological headspace as the people who lived in the Middle East over 1,000 years ago.
It's really wild to think about.
It is. So today we are taking a deep dive into an incredibly rich, dense text that explores the origins, the justifications, and the truly mind-bending metaphysics of Persian Sufism. Our mission today is to strip away the academic jargon and figure out why this movement emerged, how it synthesized these clashing worldviews into a philosophy of love, and we want to explore its three main metaphysical branches.
Right, which are reality as will, reality as beauty, and reality as light or thought.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this specific text doesn't just treat Sufism as a standard religious offshoot or, just a footnote in a history textbook. The author frames it as a profound psychological and philosophical evolution.
It's an evolution of the mind.
Yeah, it is the story of human consciousness trying to solve the problem of its own suffering and alienation. It's a mind reacting dynamically to a highly toxic environment.
Let's start right there, actually, with how this movement began. Because the text comes out swinging. In the very first chapter, the author picks a massive fight with 19th and 20th century Orientalist scholars. He calls out names like von Kramer, Merks, Nicholson.
He really does not hold back.
He doesn't. He basically looks at how these esteemed European historians have tried to explain where Persian Sufism came from, and he tells them they are completely fundamentally wrong.
Because the author is attacking a deeply ingrained academic habit. It's this tendency to trace everything back to a simple linear chain of influences, like A causes B. For instance, scholars like von Kramer and Dozy, they looked at Sufism and said, well, it talks a lot about the illusion of reality, so they obviously just copied the Indian Vedanta.
Ah, okay.
And then you have Merks and Nicholson, who looked at the mystical aspects and claimed, no, this is clearly just Greek Neoplatonism that was imported into the Middle East. You even had Professor Brown, who framed it as a sort of Aryan racial reaction against what he viewed as an unemotional Semitic religion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I have to be honest, I have a hard time buying the author's outrage here.
Really? Why is that?
Well, if I am living in Persia, right, and the trade rates are open, And an Indian traveler hands me a book on Vedanta, and suddenly my philosophy starts sounding exactly like Vedantic philosophy. I mean, the simplest, most logical explanation is that I copied him. Why is the author so obsessed with proving that Persia invented this in a vacuum? It just seems like a natural consequence of cultural exchange.
I get that. It seems logical until you examine how human psychology actually adopts ideas.
Hmm.
The text argues that this A causes B view of history is based on a completely false notion of causation.
Okay.
The author uses this fantastic historical parallel to explain it. He points to the fall of the Roman Empire. A lazy historian will just say, the barbarian invasions caused the dissolution of the Roman Empire.
Which is what we're all taught in school.
Exactly. But that completely ignores the internal rot. It ignores the political fracturing, the economic decay, the agricultural failures, and their reliance on mercenary armies that made the empire vulnerable in the first place. If Rome hadn't been in a specific state of internal decline, it could have assimilated those invasions. And frankly, for centuries, it did exactly that.
Oh, I see. So the external force only matters if the internal structure is already primed to receive it.
Precisely.
Let me try an analogy to bring this into the modern day. Let's say you started doing yoga, and I asked you why. If you told me I started doing yoga because a new studio opened up on my street, that would be the external influence.
Right, the A causes B.
Yeah, but that completely ignores the reality of your life. It ignores the fact that you were, say, desperately stressed out from your job, you were having trouble sleeping, your back was in constant pain, and you were actively, consciously looking for a way to find physical and mental peace.
That's a perfect analogy. The studio opening was just the spark.
Right. The internal condition matters way more. If you weren't stressed and in pain, you would have just walked past that studio every single day and never gone inside.
That captures the author's thesis perfectly. The text makes a beautiful, emphatic point. It says, no idea can seize a people's soul unless, in some sense, it is the people's own.
That's a great quote.
Yeah. The human mind possesses an independent individuality. It can evolve truths out of itself, acting on its own initiative. It might arrive at truths that other minds on the other side of the world anticipated ages ago.
Sure.
External influences, like an imported Greek text or an Indian traveler, they might wake the mind up from a deep slumber, but they do not create the idea out of nothing. The mind of the society has to be ripe for the idea.
Yeah. So, if the Persian mind was the stressed-out person looking for a yoga studio, what exactly was their stress? What was the crucible of 8th and 9th century Islamic life that made the people so desperate for the mystical peace of Sufism?
It was intense.
Because the text outlines 6 major pre-existing conditions, and when you dig into them, it sounds like a recipe for a massive societal breakdown.
It was an incredibly turbulent era. Let's examine what daily life actually felt like. The first condition the text identifies is intense political unrest. We're talking about the latter half of the 8th century, which saw the violent overthrow of the Umayyad dynasty in 749 AD.
Wow, okay.
The Umayyads had ruled a massive empire, and their downfall led to continuous persecutions and instability. Then you had constant revolts. The text specifically highlights a figure known as the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, who operated around 777 to 780 AD.
Wait, the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan? That sounds like a villain from a fantasy novel. Who was this guy?
I know, it really does. He was a Persian heretic who essentially capitalized on the chaos. He worked on the credulity of the desperate masses, cloaking his own political and military projects under religious guises. He literally wore a veil to obscure his face and build this massive cult of personality.
Oh, wow.
It is a classic example of opportunist rising in a power vacuum.
So you have constant regime change, violent overthrows, and cult leaders starting uprisings. And then later, the sons of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid Mamun and Amin, they're locked in a terrible, destructive civil war for political supremacy.
Yes.
On top of that, you have the Mazdakite Babak Revolt, which was another massive rebellion that seriously disrupted what was supposed to be the golden age of Islamic literature. If you were just a regular person or a thinker trying to find some peace, you never know who is in charge, and the people in charge are always burning things down.
And just imagine the psychological toll of that. The author argues it literally drives away spirits of a devotional character from the public sphere. When the external world is just a scene of continual unrest and bloodshed, the mind seeks refuge.
It retreats.
Exactly. It seeks the blissful peace of an ever-deepening contemplative life. And that political disillusionment directly feeds the second condition, which is skeptical rationalism.
The intellectual rebellion. I noticed the text mentions a fascinating figure here. the blind Persian poet Bashar ibn Burd.
Yes, he's a prime example.
He apparently deified fire, openly mocked orthodox dogma, and just completely scoffed at all non-Persian modes of thought.
Bashar ibn Burd represents a growing, pervasive intellectual cynicism of the era. The germs of skepticism that were latent in rationalism were creating a massive crisis of faith. Because when pure reason is applied ruthlessly to religious dogma, it starts to deconstruct everything.
Right.
But pure reason doesn't offer comfort. It just dismantles. The text actually makes a brilliant comparison here. It compares this 8th century crisis to how, centuries later in Europe, the negative results of Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason drove thinkers like Jacobi and Schleiermacher to base faith entirely on feeling.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or how the poet Wordsworth, who was exhausted by the rigid rationality of the Enlightenment, sought a mystical state of mind to see into the life of things. When the intellect alone leaves people cold, it necessitates an appeal to a super-intellectual source of knowledge.
Which makes total sense, because if you look at the religious authorities at the time, they weren't offering much comfort either. And that brings us to the third and fourth conditions, which are unemotional piety and sectarian wrangling.
Right.
The text describes how the masses were being strictly ruled by various orthodox schools of Islam, the Hanafite, the Shafi'ite, the Malikite, and especially the anthropomorphic Hanbalite school.
The author describes the Hanbalite school in particular as the bitterest enemy of independent thought. They focused on a highly literal, rigid interpretation of texts. When religion becomes merely a code of strict rules and unemotional piety, it loses its psychological utility.
It stops helping people.
Exactly. It no longer comforts the soul. It just dictates behavior.
And what happens when religion is just a giant list of rigid rules? People start arguing over the minutiae of those rules. The text talks about bitter theological controversies, especially between the Asherites and the advocates of rationalism. It confined religion within incredibly narrow limits.
Yes, it becomes very petty.
To put it in a modern context, it's like when you see people arguing endlessly in the comments section of a news article over some tiny semantic detail. At some point, the exhaustion just hits you. You want to turn the screen off, walk outside, and look at a tree.
Absolutely.
You crave something larger, something transcendent, to wash away all the petty debates.
That exhaustion is a very powerful catalyst for mysticism. People realize that debating the exact nature of God's attributes doesn't bring them any closer to the divine presence. And compounding all of this is the fifth condition, which is moral laxity.
Right, the wealth.
Yeah. Due to the rationalistic tendency of the early Abbasid period and the rapid influx of wealth from a massive empire, there's a growing indifference to religious life in the upper circles of society.
So let's just paint the full picture here. The elites are getting fabulously wealthy and morally loose, flaunting the rules. The religious scholars are furiously arguing with each other over the exact wording of the rules. The politicians are assassinating each other to control the empire, and the rationalist philosophers are standing on the sidelines, cynically mocking all of them.
It is a complete systemic societal burnout.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the sixth and final condition. And this acts as a profound visual contrast to all that chaos, the presence of Christianity as a working ideal of life.
Yeah, this is a really important piece of the puzzle.
This surprised me, honestly. Why would an Islamic society in the Middle East care about Christianity?
The text is very specific here. It notes that it was not Christian theological ideas that influenced them. It was the actual lived experience of the Christian hermits and monks in the region that fascinated early Islamic saints.
Ah, the visual power of that is striking. You are living in a society obsessed with wealth, power, and endless debate, and then you walk out into the desert or up a mountain and you see a monk, someone who has completely renounced all of it. Someone living a life of utter unworldliness and silence.
The text says it was extremely charming in itself. It was incredibly alluring. Now, the author believes that extreme asceticism and unworldliness were actually quite contrary to the original practical spirit of early Islam, which was very much about building a just society in the real world.
Right.
But you can easily see why the hermit's life appealed to an exhausted Persian mind.
Right.
So if we look at the entire landscape, the political chaos, paralyzing skepticism, unemotional rules, sectarian fighting, moral decay of the rich, and the appealing, quiet example of the ascetic monk, we see the true origins of Sufism.
The Persian mind didn't just passively adopt a foreign idea. It organically evolved a desperate, profound solution to its own suffering, utilizing whatever spiritual tools were available in its environment.
It is a brilliant historical reframing.
It really is. The soil wasn't just ready, It was screaming for a new kind of seed. And the philosophical solution they evolved was incredibly robust. That brings us to how Sufism actually functioned as a restatement of faith. The text explains its extraordinary vitality by looking at what it calls the three formulas of salvation.
This is such a fascinating way to categorize how different world religions try to fix the human condition. It is a masterful distillation of religious philosophy.
Let's go through them.
Sure, the author lays out three distinct approaches to salvation. First, you have what they categorize as the Semitic formula of salvation. This is broadly associated with the early orthodox forms of Judaism and Islam. The core directive of this formula is simple: transform your will.
Right. The focus is entirely on action, on conduct, on obeying a strict code of laws. If you want to be saved, you follow the commandments, you do good things, you restrict bad actions. It's very external.
Exactly. The assumption is that the essence of the human soul is the will. If you control the will, you control the person.
Okay, what's the second?
On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Aryan or Indian Vedantist formula. This philosophy looks at the suffering of the world and diagnoses it differently. It teaches that all pain is due to our mistaken attitude towards the universe. We are suffering because we believe the illusion of reality is real. Therefore, its core directive is transform your understanding.
So instead of focusing on what you do, you focus on how you think. It's an intellectual system aimed at piercing through the veil of Maya, or illusion. One formula says change your actions, the other says change your thoughts.
Exactly.
But Sufism looks at both of these established systems and says you are both missing the core of human nature.
The Sufi contends that the mere transformation of the will, or the mere transformation of the understanding, will never bring true peace. You can force someone to follow rules, but their heart might be full of resentment. You can teach someone the intellectual truth of the universe, but they might remain cold and disconnected.
Right, something is still missing.
Sufism attempts to synthesize both the Semitic and the Aryan formulas into a higher, more complete category. And that category is love.
Their directive is transform your feeling. The will and the understanding will naturally follow because they are just specialized forms of feeling. The message is to love all and forget your own individuality in doing good to others.
It is a profound psychological insight. Think about it in practical terms. If you genuinely love someone, you don't have to force your will to treat them well.
No, it just happens.
Exactly. The right action flows effortlessly from the right feeling. And your understanding of that person is illuminated by your affection for them.
Yeah.
You don't have to enforce the law if you possess the love.
There is a quote in the text from the legendary mystic poet Rumi that just stopped me in my tracks. It beautifully captures how radical the shift was.
Oh, I know the one.
Rumi writes, "To win other people's hearts is the greatest pilgrimage, and one heart is worth more than 1,000 Kaabas. Kaaba is a mere cottage of Abraham, but the heart is the very home of God."
It is breathtaking poetry, but we cannot understate what a radical theological statement that is. The Kaaba in Mecca is the holiest site in Islam. It's the physical focal point of global prayer. And Rumi is saying that a single human heart is worth 1,000 of them.
It's massive.
He is completely shifting the center of religious gravity away from the external architectural institution and placing it entirely within the internal biological human experience.
Which immediately made me wonder, how on earth did they not get executed for saying things like that? I mean, if you were walking around the 9th century saying the human heart is more important than the Kaaba, the rigid, unemotional dogmatists we talked about earlier would have a massive problem with that.
Oh, they definitely did.
So how did the Sufis justify this from a strictly Quranic standpoint? They had to have a defense, right?
They did. And they were very meticulous about finding their justification within the Quran itself. They couldn't just invent a new religion. They had to prove they were the true inheritors of the original revelation.
Okay, so how did they do it?
The text outlines how Sufi writers contended that the Prophet Muhammad had an esoteric teaching, a hidden wisdom that was passed down alongside the literal teaching contained in the book.
So they argued there was a surface meaning for the masses and a deeper meaning for the mystics. What was their textual proof for this?
They point to specific verses, primarily Surah 2, verse 146. It reads, "As we have sent a prophet to you from among yourselves who reads our verses to you, purifies you, teaches you the book and the wisdom, and teaches you what you did not know before."
Ah, I see the linguistic loophole there.
You caught it.
Yeah, they argue that if wisdom was just the exact same thing as the book, using both words in the same sentence would be redundant. God doesn't waste words. Therefore, the wisdom must be a separate, inner, esoteric teaching.
Precisely. Furthermore, they lean heavily on how the Quran defines true believers. It defines Muslims as those who believe in the unseen. The crucial theological question then becomes, what and where is this unseen?
Right.
The orthodox scholars might say it's heaven or angels out there in the cosmos, but the Sufi commentators look to other verses. They point to the verse that says, "And in the earth there are signs to those who believe, and in yourself what do you not then see?" Or the famous verse, "We are nigher to him than his own jugular vein."
The unseen isn't somewhere up in the clouds. It is located directly within your own biology, within your own soul. And based on this internal location of the unseen, the commentators developed 4 distinct stages of spiritual training. I want to walk through these because it's fascinating, but I need you to help me translate what they actually look like in practice.
Let's break them down.
Okay, so stage 1 is belief in the unseen. This seems pretty straightforward. You just have to intellectually accept that there is a deeper reality beyond the physical world.
Right, that's the baseline entry point.
Then stage 2 is search after the unseen. And the text says they do this by looking at nature. It quotes the verse, "Look at the camel, how it is created. The skies, how they are exalted."
Yes. Stage 2 is the observation of the macrocosm. You look outward to see the signs of the divine design. You study the intricate biology of the camel, the terrifying vastness of the sky, and you realize that the physical world points to an invisible architect.
Then we get to stage 3, the knowledge of the unseen. This is where you take that observational energy and turn the camera around. You look into the depths of your own soul. You study your own consciousness.
You move from the macrocosm to the microcosm.
Exactly. And finally, stage 4, the realization. And this is the part that I found most surprising. According to the higher Sufism, this ultimate realization doesn't result from just sitting in a cave meditating forever. It results from the constant practice of justice and charity.
That last point is absolutely vital to understanding Persian Sufism. It prevents the philosophy from becoming a purely selfish, isolating endeavor. You realize the ultimate truth of the universe not by escaping humanity, but by engaging with it perfectly.
Wow.
You attain unity by treating others with justice and charity. Ethical, social action is the vehicle for mystical realization.
Now, speaking of vehicles for realization, the author of our source text takes a rather sharp detour here to critique some later Sufi fraternities. It's kind of funny how fiercely protective the author is of what he considers the pure Persian lineage.
He is very protective of his specific philosophical tradition.
He specifically calls out groups like the Naqshbandi order, basically accusing them of stealing meditation techniques from Hindu Vedantists. He says they imitated the Hindu doctrine of Kundalini. They taught that there are 6 great centers of light, various colored lights located in the human body, and the goal is to make these colored lights move or become current through meditation until you realize a fundamental colorless light.
The author is highly critical of this. He explicitly states that these methods are quite un-Islamic in character and insists that the higher Sufis do not attach any importance to them.
It's a great reminder of how deeply sectarian these historical debates can be. Obviously, we are just looking at this text as a historical artifact. We aren't here to declare whether Hindu Kundalini practices or Naqshbandi meditation techniques are theologically valid or Islamic.
Of course not.
But reading the author's disdain for these colored light meditations really shows you how passionately he wants to protect the intellectual rigor of the specific philosophical schools he is about to introduce.
It serves as a perfect boundary marker. The author is saying we are not talking about colored lights in the body, we are talking about robust, rigorous metaphysics. And that brings us to the absolute core of the text.
Let's get into it.
The author outlines how Sufism looked at the ultimate reality from 3 different metaphysical standpoints: reality as self-conscious will, reality as beauty, and reality as light or thought.
The text mentions that the first school, reality as will, was mostly about piety, an intense consciousness of sin, and a terrifying longing for God. The author notes they didn't really philosophize much, they just felt deeply. So let's focus our attention on the second school, reality as beauty.
This is where things get really interesting.
This emerges around the 9th century, and there is a distinct shift here from pure faith to knowledge. And this is where the paradigm of how the universe was created gets completely flipped on its head.
The shift is monumental. To understand it, we have to look at what they were rejecting. The text notes that these new teachers abandoned the old Neoplatonic theory of emanation.
Let's break that down because emanation was the dominant theory of the time. Emanation is basically the idea that the universe just sort of spilled out of God. If God is a fountain of pure existence and the fountain gets too full, the water overflows and drips down. The highest, purest drops are angels, the lower drops are humans, and the muddy drops at the bottom are physical matter.
That is a great visual. But the problem with emanation is that it implies creation was an accident or merely a passive necessity. The water didn't choose to overflow, it just did.
Right, there's no intent there.
Exactly.
All right.
This school of Sufism, which includes philosophers like Avicenna, found that lacking. They looked upon the ultimate reality not as a passive fountain, but as eternal beauty. And if you ask what the fundamental nature of beauty is, the answer is that beauty inherently desires to manifest itself. It wants to see its own face reflected.
Therefore, they viewed the universe not as an accidental puddle of emanation, but as a deliberate mirror.
Exactly. The cause of creation is the manifestation of beauty. And the very first creation, the force that polished the mirror, was love.
Rumi defines this love as the sacred fire which burns up everything other than God. The universe isn't a mistake. It is a deliberate act of a beautiful reality wanting to perceive itself. And everything in the universe, every star, every tree, every human is just a reflection in that mirror.
And this leads to a radical conclusion. If everything is just a reflection in the mirror of absolute existence, then your feeling of being a separate, independent individual is a complete illusion.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the text introduces this beautiful parable by a mystic named Nasafi to explain the tragedy of this illusion. I want to spend some time on this because this parable is incredibly haunting.
It's one of my favorites.
Nasafi first explains that there are two kinds of mirrors. There's external nature, which just shows a fuzzy, generalized, reflected image of God. And then there is man, the human consciousness, which shows the real essence. But man is a limitation of the absolute, and we erroneously think we are independent entities.
I think we're separate.
Right. Nasafi says, O dervish, dost thou think that thy existence is independent of God? This is a great error. And to explain this error, he gives the parable of the fishes. He says there were fishes in a certain tank who realized that they lived, moved, and had their being in something called water. But they felt quite ignorant of the real nature of what constituted the very source of their life. They didn't know what water actually was.
They're swimming in it, but they don't know it.
Exactly. So they swam out to the great sea to find a wiser fish. And this philosopher fish addresses them with this devastating line. He says, O you who endeavor to untie the knot of being, you are born in union, yet die in the thought of an unreal separation. Thirsty on the seashore, dying penniless while master of the treasure.
Thirsty on the seashore. It is a striking, tragic image. It perfectly encapsulates the human condition according to this school of thought. All feeling of separation is ignorance. All otherness is a mere appearance, a dream. The fish are looking for the water while they are breathing it.
Think about how deeply this applies to our modern lives. How often are we completely unaware of the mediums we exist in? Think about culture or language or even the sheer fact of consciousness itself.
We take it completely for granted.
We are swimming in it. We spend our whole lives looking everywhere for the answer or the truth or God. We buy books, we go to retreats, we argue online looking for this elusive thing. And we are exactly like the fish asking where the water is. We're looking for something that is already everywhere, including inside our own eyes. We are thirsty on the seashore.
And because we are intrinsically part of this universal medium, because we are the water, this school of thought develops a fascinating perspective on the progression of the soul. The text quotes a famous passage from Rumi's Masnavi that sounds shockingly modern. It anticipates the concept of evolution centuries before Charles Darwin.
This part of the text completely floored me. Rumi writes about how man first appeared in the class of inorganic things, rocks and minerals. Then he passed from that state into the state of plants. For years, he lived as a vegetative soul, forgetting his life as a rock. Then, from the vegetative state, he passed into the animal state, forgetting his life as a plant. And finally, the Creator drew man out of the animal state into the human state. Rumi writes, thus man passed from one order of nature to another, till he became wise and knowing and strong as he is now.
It is a profound spiritual Darwinism. Rumi didn't view this as random mutation. He regarded this evolutionary process as the realistic biological side of his idealism.
Interesting.
The universal soul is working its way through the various spheres of being. It starts asleep in the rock, dreams in the plant, wakes up in the animal, and becomes self-conscious in the human. It is the universe slowly building a better and better mirror to reflect its own beauty.
It's just staggering that an intellectual framework from the 13th century feels so deeply resonant with a modern scientific understanding of biological progression. They intuited the mechanics of evolution, but layered it with this profound teleological meaning.
Which serves as a perfect transition to the third great school of Sufism discussed in the text, reality as light. If the reality as beauty school focused on mirrors and poetic reflections, this next school develops an incredibly complex, logically rigorous, almost mathematical system of metaphysics, and it centers around a truly remarkable, tragic historical figure.
Sheikh Shahabal-Din Suhrawardi, also known by his honorific, Shaykh al-Ishraq Maktul. This guy was a brilliant young Persian thinker. The text says he stood completely unrivaled in the whole Islamic world for his intellect. But his story does not have a happy ending.
No, it doesn't.
He was martyred. He was executed at the age of 36.
Yes, the author of our source text is intensely passionate about this history. He states that Suhrawardi's independent opinions aroused the bitter jealousy of contemporary theologians, and the author does not mince words. He refers to these theologians as hired slaves of bloodthirsty dogmatism.
Wow.
He claims they conspired to convince the Sultan that Suhrawardi's teaching was a direct danger to Islam and needed to be violently nipped in the bud.
The venom in the author's pen is palpable there. Hired slaves of bloodthirsty dogmatism is quite the historical indictment. It shows you how deeply personal the intellectual history of Persia is to the writer. We, of course, are looking at this from a distance, analyzing the author's passionate defense of a 12th century philosopher without needing to weigh in on the sectarian politics of the Sultan's court.
Exactly.
Our focus is on what made Suhrawardi so dangerous. What was this philosophy of illumination, the Ishraqi philosophy, that got a 36-year-old genius killed?
The first thing Suhrawardi does, which was incredibly audacious, is attempt to completely tear down the foundation of Greek philosophy that was dominant in the Islamic world at the time. He specifically targets Aristotelian logic, and his critique is brilliant.
He goes right for the throat of how Aristotle defined the world. To understand this, we need to understand Aristotle's formula. Aristotle said that to define anything, you need two things: the genus and the differentia.
Correct. The genus is the broad category a thing belongs to. The differentia is the specific, unique attribute that separates it from everything else in that category.
So, to use the classic example, Aristotle defines a horse as a neighing animal. Animality is the broad genus. Neighing is the differentia, the unique attribute.
Right.
Now, Suhrawardi looks at this cornerstone of Western logic and says, this is entirely useless for actually gaining knowledge because, sure, we understand the concept of animality because we've seen lots of different animals, dogs, cats, cows, but the attribute of neighing, that exists nowhere else in the universe except in a horse.
His point is devastatingly simple. If you have never seen or heard a horse, the word neighing brings you absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. The definition relies on you already having experienced the thing it is trying to define.
Let's use a modern analogy. It's like trying to describe a strawberry to someone who has never eaten one. Using Aristotle's logic, you would say a strawberry is a red seeded fruit. Okay, the person knows what red is, they know what seeds are, they know what fruit is, they understand the genus.
But the actual taste.
Exactly, the actual specific, unique taste of a strawberry. The differentia. If they haven't tasted it, your definition is completely useless. The words simply cannot transfer the essence of the experience.
Therefore, Suhrawardi argues, unaided reason, pure intellect, relying on logical, linguistic definitions, is fundamentally untrustworthy. It only understands abstract theory. It builds a map, but it never walks the territory. Intellect must be supplemented by something else to verify and correct it.
And that vital supplement is a concept he calls doubt.
Doubt translates roughly to an inner, mysterious perception of the essence of things. It is the direct tasting of reality, rather than just reading the menu. Suhrawardi claims that only doubt brings true knowledge and peace to the restless soul, disarming skepticism forever, because you can't be skeptical of something you have directly tasted.
I love that concept. You can't logic your way to understanding a strawberry. You have to experience the doubt of the strawberry.
That's a great way to put it.
But Suhrawardi doesn't just leave it at vague, mysterious feelings. He builds an entire, highly structured ontology and cosmology of light out of this direct perception.
He does. In his system, the ultimate principle of all existence is Nuri Kahir, the primal absolute light.
Yeah.
And he argues that its essential nature consists in perpetual illumination. The text notes his logic here. It says nothing is more visible than light, and visibility does not stand in need of any definition.
Light just is. You don't need a genus and differentia to define light to someone. You just open their eyes. And this primal light is the source of absolutely everything. But here is the fascinating philosophical twist. If God is pure light, what about darkness? In a lot of ancient Persian religions, like Zoroastrianism, you have a strict literal dualism. You have a god of light and a separate, independent, evil god of darkness locked in an eternal cosmic war.
Suhrawardi explicitly rejects that dualism.
Hmm.
He argues that the not light, or darkness, is not something distinct proceeding from an independent evil source. The relation between light and darkness is not a battle of opposites. It is simply existence and non-existence. Darkness is just the necessary negation of light.
It's just a shadow. A shadow isn't a thing that projects itself into the world. A shadow has no mass, no energy. It is just the spatial location where the light has been blocked or hasn't reached yet.
Precisely.
So if everything that exists is light and darkness is just the absence of it, why does anything move? Why is the universe dynamic, with planets orbiting and rivers flowing and creatures growing, instead of just a static, frozen orb of glowing light?
The engine of the universe, according to Suhrawardi, is love. He says this primordial light is the source of all motion, but its motion is due to the love of illumination. The light stirs itself up to quicken all things into life by pouring its rays into their being.
And all the physical things that are created, which are just lesser, softer, microred reflections of that primal light trapped in the forms of darkness, they all move because they desperately want to drink the light.
They crave it.
The text has this incredibly poetic, staggering sentence to describe gravity and motion. It says, "The universe, in one word, is a petrified desire, a crystallized longing after light."
A petrified desire. I want to linger on that because it is an astonishing way to view physics and cosmology. Think about a plant bending toward the sun, or even atomic particles drawing together. In Suhrawardi's view, things are fed by their respective illuminations, and they constantly move with a lover's passion to get closer to the original fountain. The entire physical world is an eternal drama of love. Matter is just desire that is frozen to physical form, trying to thaw itself out in the light.
It gives me chills just thinking about it. But how does this relate to us biologically? Suhrawardi was not just a cosmologist. He has a whole psychology section that maps this dynamic of light and darkness onto the human body. He presents a biological problem. The abstract soul, which is pure, immaterial illumination, cannot directly touch the dark, solid, heavy physical body. They are on opposite poles of reality.
Right.
If pure light touches pure dirt, there is no connection. They need a medium. A bridge.
This is where his historical biological theory comes in. He posits the existence of an animal soul. The text describes this animal soul as a hot, fine, transparent vapor. It has its principal seat in the left cavity of the heart, but it circulates in all parts of the body through the nervous system.
Now, to a modern listener, a hot, fine vapor in the left cavity of the heart sounds like magical thinking. But why did this make so much sense in the 12th century?
We have to view this through the lens of historical medicine. This aligns perfectly with the medical science of the era, which was heavily influenced by Galen and the theory of humors. The heart was viewed as the furnace of the body, the literal source of vital heat.
Ah, okay.
When they open bodies, the left ventricle of the heart is thicker and often empty of pooled blood after death, leading early anatomists to believe it contained the pneuma or vital spirit, a hot vapor. So Suhrawardi is using the absolute cutting-edge medical science of his day to explain a metaphysical concept. The vapor is fine enough to interact with the spiritual light, but physical enough to move the muscles of the dark body.
It's the perfect biological bridge. And the bond between the soul and the body isn't just mechanical cause and effect. It isn't just hydraulic pressure moving the limbs. Again, the bond of union between them is love. The dark body longs for illumination, and it receives that light through the vapor of the soul.
And the ultimate goal of human life, therefore, is to rise higher and higher in the scale of being, receiving more and more illumination to free the soul from the heavy world of darkness. This elevation is achieved through both philosophical knowledge and ethical action.
The text outlines the 5 stages of this spiritual development, and it reads almost like a guided meditation into cosmic consciousness. I want to walk through this slowly because it shows exactly how the human ego is systematically dismantled in this philosophy.
Let's do it.
Stage 1 is the stage of I. This is the baseline. This is where most of us live every single day. The feeling of personality is predominant, and human action is driven entirely by selfishness. I want this, I need that, I am hungry, I am angry.
Very relatable.
Yes. Then stage 2 is the stage of thou art not.
This stage requires a little clarification. It is a complete absorption in one's own deep self, to the entire forgetfulness of everything external. You close your eyes to the outside world, the thou meaning the external worlds, or even the external concept of God, vanishes from your immediate concern as you dive inward.
You shut out the noise. Which leads to stage 3, I am not. This is the necessary result of diving deep enough in the second stage. As you look closer and closer at your own ego, you realize it is just a collection of memories and reactionary desires. The ego starts to dissolve.
It is the realization that the separate self is a complete illusion. The I does not exist in the way we thought it did.
Which opens the door for stage 4, thou art. Once the I is gone, there is a vacuum. And that vacuum is filled by the acclamation of the thou, the ultimate light. This means complete resignation to the will of the primal light. You become an empty vessel for it.
Beautifully said.
And finally, we reach stage 5, the pinnacle of human spiritual evolution. I am not, and thou art not.
The complete negation of both terms of thought. It is the state of pure cosmic consciousness. There is no observer and there is no observed. There is no me praying to God. There is only the light itself experiencing itself. All dualism, all separation is annihilated.
It is profoundly heavy. And it's amazing that this incredibly rigorous, structured metaphysics of light, which dismantles the ego so beautifully, was built by a man who was killed for it at the age of 36. Suhrawardi truly was a martyr for his vision of reality.
He absolutely was.
But our deep dive doesn't stop there. The text moves on to one final school of thought, championed by a thinker named Al-Jili, who lived a bit later in the 14th century. And Al-Jili brings a slightly different flavor to the conversation. If Suhrawardi was the philosopher of light, Al-Jili is the philosopher of pure thought.
Yes, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Al-Jili is fascinating because he combined wild poetical imagination with rigorous philosophical genius. In his view, the essence of God, or ultimate reality, is pure thought. But he introduces a critical linguistic dilemma. Pure thought cannot be understood directly by the human mind. No words can express it.
Why not? I mean, if we have minds, why can't we understand pure thought?
Because of the nature of knowledge itself. Knowledge inherently requires a relationship. To know something, there must be a knower, which is you, and a known, which is the object. It requires division. But pure being, the absolute, has no parts. It has no divisions. It is beyond all relation. Therefore, it is entirely unknowable in its pure state.
So we are completely locked out. If we can't know it, how do we interact with it? Al-Jili says we rely on names and attributes. This is where he introduces the concept of the husk and the pith.
This is where Al-Jili anticipates modern cognitive science and linguistics. He's describing how language and conceptualization work to bound reality. He says the name fixes the named in the understanding. It pictures it in the mind, presents it in the imagination, and keeps it in the memory.
The name is the outside, or the husk of the named, while the named itself is the inside, or the pith. The name is just a mirror through which the absolute being reveals its secrets. Let's use an analogy to make this concrete. Think about how we name a hurricane. Out there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there is a formless, chaotic, massive transfer of thermal energy, wind, and water. It has no sharp boundaries. You can't point to exactly where the storm ends and the normal breeze begins. Human minds cannot easily process a formless mass of terrifying energy. So what do? We give it a name. We call it Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Ian.
And the moment you name it, you give it a boundary in the human mind. You can track it on a map. You can talk about it with your neighbors. You can relate to it. You can fear it. But, and this is Al-Jili's crucial point, the word Katrina is not the wind. The word is not the rain that floods the streets. The word is just a sound we make. The word is the husk. The actual devastating meteorological event is the pith.
That is brilliant. The name exists solely to help our limited, relationship-dependent minds interact with something vastly beyond our comprehension or control. Al-Jili says that we can only seek the named through the name. We have to use the husks of language, the titles of God, the attributes of mercy or wrath to try and get a glimpse of the pure thought inside. But we must never confuse the map for the territory.
It is a profoundly sophisticated understanding of semantics and theology. It acknowledges the fundamental limits of the human intellect, while still providing a valid pathway for mystical experience. The mystic uses the intellect to pierce through the veil of names and attributes to find an existence which is, to the rational mind, a sum of total contradictions.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring all these incredible threads together. We started by looking at the exhausted Persian mind in the 8th and 9th centuries, living through political chaos, the cynicism of blind poets, the rigid rules of orthodox scholars, and the endless bickering of theologians. That unbearable noise drove brilliant minds to look inward for salvation. We saw the Sufi synthesis, the revolutionary idea that you don't just force a change in your actions or cold-heartedly change your thoughts, but you completely transform your feeling through love. We heard Rumi telling us that the human heart is the true Kaaba.
We tracked the evolution of their metaphysics. We saw the rejection of the cold, passive theory of emanation in favor of the mirror. The universe isn't an accident. It is eternal beauty deliberately admiring itself, and humanity is the ultimate mirror, even if we are tragically like fish, unaware of the water we swim in.
We explored Suhrawardi's dramatic, beautiful cosmology, where darkness is just a shadow, and the entire physical universe is a petrified desire reaching for the primal light. We learned how they used 12th century biology to explain how our hot, vaporous animal souls bridge the gap between pure illumination and dark matter, trying to elevate us through the 5 stages of consciousness until the ego completely vanishes into the light.
And finally, we arrived at Al-Jili, who humbles our intellect by reminding us that all our concepts, all our doctrines, and all our words are merely the husks of a reality that is pure, unadulterated thought.
Having journeyed through all of this, it raises a profoundly important question for you, the listener. Think about how you are framing your own reality right now, today. When you are faced with the noise and the stress of your modern life, how are you reacting? Are you just trying to grit your teeth and force a change in your will, like the Semitic formula? Are you just trying to over-intellectualize and detach from the world, like the Aryan formula? Or are you actively finding a way to transform your feelings? Are you moving through the world driven by the love of illumination?
This raises an important question, really. It is a call to examine the medium you are swimming in. Are you aware of the water? When you look at your beliefs, your anxieties, your arguments, are you mistaking the linguistic husk for the actual pith of reality?
So, what does this all mean for us as we turn off this deep dive and go back into the world? I want to leave you with a thought built on Al-Jili's concept of names. If language really is just the husk and our minds can only seek the truth through the boundaries of the words we possess, how many profound, invisible forces in your life are you entirely missing? How many complex dynamics in your relationships or quiet tectonic shifts in your own mind are you completely blind to, simply because you haven't yet invented a name for them?
We only perceive what we can frame. If the vocabulary of our inner life remains limited to modern anxieties, our experience of reality will remain trapped in that anxiety.
We started this deep dive talking about the heavy feeling of being overwhelmed by the modern world. That feeling that the diagnostic machine of our culture is broken, and we are just staring into muddy waters, unable to make sense of the noise. But maybe the noise isn't the actual problem. Maybe, exactly like those 8th century Persian thinkers, the noise is just the catalyst. It is the necessary pressure that forces us to stop looking at the chaos outside and start searching for the light inside. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the reality around you, keep looking for the water you are swimming in, and we will catch you next time.
Usually when we try to understand how the universe works today, there's this underlying expectation of machinery. Like, we imagine reality as a giant, intricate clock.
Right, it's very mechanical.
Exactly. You look through a telescope, you see the gears turning the orbits, the gravity, cosmic radiation, and the physicist just points to the data and says, well, there it is. That's reality. Observable, measurable, clean.
And I mean, it's deeply comforting, isn't it? We like reality to be quantifiable. We want it to be something we can weigh, track on a spreadsheet, put into a neat little box defined by mathematics and physics.
Yeah, totally. But step into the world of historical metaphysics, specifically the centuries of later Persian thought that we're exploring today, and suddenly that telescope is completely useless.
Oh, completely. The measuring tape is gone.
The spreadsheet is blank. We're looking at a landscape of reality that, isn't built of atoms or gravity. It is built out of pure ideas. We're taking a deep dive into a universe constructed entirely out of the human mind's attempt to understand itself.
Where abstract concepts like absolute light and primal love aren't just poetry. They are the actual fundamental physics of existence.
And the wildest part is that this isn't just idle daydreaming by guys sitting in ivory towers. These purely abstract ideas slowly mutated over hundreds of years and eventually sparked a real-world, boots-on-the-ground political revolution.
That is the massive arc we are tracing today. We're looking at how human beings take incredibly conflicting ideas like ancient Persian dualism, where light and darkness are in a literal cosmic war, and smash them together with the rigorous logic of Greek philosophy.
Right, and then wrap it all in the overarching framework of Islamic theology. But to understand how this intellectual revolution blossomed into actual political upheaval, we have to start at a point where thought itself was almost entirely extinguished.
Yes, we have to start in a philosophical winter.
And just a quick note for you as we dive in while our source text delves deeply into Islamic, Zoroastrian, and Babist theology, we're exploring these strictly as philosophical movements and historical events. We are not endorsing any specific religious or political viewpoint.
Right, we're impartially tracing the evolution of these ideas exactly as they are presented in the historical texts.
Okay, let's unpack this. We start with the Tartar invasion of Persia.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the Tartars invading, we usually just picture the military devastation.
Sure, the burning cities and all that.
But the intellectual devastation was just as profound. They brought a mindset that was fundamentally hostile to independent thought.
You really have to picture the sociological impact of an invading force that values supreme utility and unambiguous order above everything else. I mean, the Tartars were conquerors and administrators.
They wanted things clean and simple.
Exactly. To them, abstract philosophy, the nuanced, open-ended questioning that had characterized Persian thought for centuries, wasn't just useless, it was actively distasteful. It was a threat to straightforward governance.
So when you have a ruling power that views philosophical inquiry as an annoyance, the cultural momentum just stalls out entirely. The patronage disappears.
Right. The schools of thought lose their solidarity because there is no societal reward for thinking outside the lines anymore.
It's terrifying how quickly a vibrant intellectual culture can be frozen solid. And it wasn't just that they stopped translating Aristotle or debating Plato. Even the highly practical development of Islamic law suffered a massive check.
Yeah, look at Hanafite law, which was the dominant school of legal thought at the time. The Tartars looked at it and essentially considered it to be the absolute acme of human reason.
They basically said, this is perfect. The ultimate truth has been reached. Stop thinking about it.
And when a ruling class declares that the ultimate truth has already been fully articulated, it creates a suffocating environment. They viewed any further subtleties of legal interpretation as deeply disagreeable to their brains. They closed the book.
So if you're a thinker whose entire life is dedicated to exploring the margins, you suddenly find yourself living in a society that views your life's work as a nuisance. So if philosophy is suffocated from the top down, where does it go?
Well, it doesn't just evaporate, it mutates. Sufism, for instance, managed to survive this winter.
Because it had a disguise, right?
Precisely. It survived through a very specific strategy of being deeply intertwined with religion. It operated under the protective cloak of religious devotion.
So because it was outwardly associated with accepted mystical practices, Sufi thinkers could just go on systematizing old ideas and quietly evolving new ones beneath the surface.
It functioned as a kind of philosophical smuggling operation, hidden in plain sight within the bounds of mysticism.
But what about the hardcore analytical philosophers, the ones who, didn't want to hide behind mystical poetry, like the Persian Aristotelians?
They didn't have that religious camouflage, so they experienced a massive brain drain. They had to pack up and leave Persia entirely.
In the 16th century, a huge wave of these thinkers, names like Dastur Isfahani, Irbad, Munir, they fled east. They traveled to India and arrived at the court of Emperor Akbar.
And Akbar is a legendary figure for his religious and philosophical curiosity. He was actively trying to synthesize different belief systems.
He was drawing upon Zoroastrianism, Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity to form a completely new faith for himself and his courtiers.
Yes, the Dini Elahai.
And the people helping him build this new religion were mostly these exiled Persians. It's this amazing historical irony. These brilliant philosophers, forced out of their homes by an anti-intellectual regime, suddenly find themselves in this vibrant court in India.
Acting as the architects for an emperor's brand new religion.
It's like a harsh wind blowing the seeds of a garden into a neighboring country, completely altering the intellectual ecosystem over there.
But while they were fertilizing foreign soils back home in Persia, the intellectual landscape remained incredibly barren. There was a 100-year drought, a century of absolute philosophical silence.
Wow. 100 years.
Yeah, no great thinker appeared in Persia. It isn't until the 17th century that the ice finally begins to crack.
Enter Mullah Sadra of Shiraz. He bursts onto the scene in the 17th century, and he isn't just throwing out mild suggestions to restart the conversation.
No, not at all. To break a century-long intellectual drought, you have to present a paradigm-shifting concept. And he champions a highly rigorous, logically unassailable system.
And his core tenet is one of the most notoriously difficult yet profound ideas in all of metaphysics, the identity of the subject and the object.
Right.
I need you to break this down for me, because on its face, it sounds completely absurd. His core idea is that reality is all things, yet is none of them, and true knowledge consists in the exact identity of the subject and the object. Let's start with the first half. How can reality be all things but none of them?
I know, it sounds like a riddle.
If I'm looking at a rock, is Milasandra saying I actually am the rock? Because that sounds like nonsense.
It does sound like nonsense if you are operating under our modern materialist assumptions, but think about the historical problem the Persian mind had been struggling with. Dualism.
The split between the observer and the observed.
Exactly, the spirit and the material world. Mullah Sadra is attempting to bridge that gap entirely. When he says, reality is all things but none of them, he means reality, the capital R, is the underlying existence that makes all specific things possible.
But it can't be reduced to any single thing.
Right, it cannot be reduced to just one specific rock or tree.
Okay, so reality isn't the tree or the rock or the person. But without reality, none of those things could exist. It's the canvas, not the paint.
That's a perfect starting point. Now apply that to knowledge. If you and the rock are both expressions of that same underlying canvas of reality, then true knowledge isn't just you, a completely separate entity looking at an object from a distance.
Oh, I see.
True knowledge is realizing that at the deepest ontological level of existence, the knower and the known are made of the exact same stuff. The subject and the object fuse.
I'm still struggling with the fusion part.
Ah.
I get that we might be made of the same underlying reality, but I clearly experience myself as me and the rock as an it.
Think of it less physically and more experientially. Have you ever been so completely engrossed in playing a piece of music or reading a truly brilliant book that your sense of self just vanishes?
Oh, definitely.
At first, you are a person sitting in a chair, holding paper, looking at ink. You are the subject, the book is the object, there's distance. But when you hit a state of pure flow, you forget the chair. You forget the paper.
You forget you were a person reading.
Exactly. The act of knowing the story and the story itself become indistinguishable.
Okay, I see that. The knower and the known fuse into one single experience.
And for Mullah Sadra, that fusion isn't just a fleeting psychological trick. It is the fundamental, permanent truth of the universe. By establishing the absolute identity of the subject and the object, he took the final, crucial step toward complete monism for the Persian intellect.
Monism meaning the idea that everything is ultimately one singular substance.
Yes, he logically proved that the fracture of dualism was an illusion.
And yet, a lot of Western observers at the time completely missed the magnitude of this. Like the French writer de Gobineau thought Sadra was just reviving old ideas, kind of doing a cover band version of older philosophers like Avicenna.
De Gobineau ignored the most vital part of Sadra's work. Avicenna still operated with a degree of separation between the essence of a thing and its existence. Sadra completely obliterated that separation.
So this abstract, highly technical argument about how the mind perceives an object actually laid the groundwork for a massive shift.
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it planted a seed that would, centuries later, become the theological foundation for the Babist Revolution.
But Mullah Sadra was mostly setting up the logical framework, right? The guy who really took this unified theory of reality and built an entire universe out of it was an 18th century giant named Mullah Hadi of Sabzwar.
Mullah Hadi is a towering figure. His major work, the Azra al-Hikam, provides the ultimate specimen of modern Persian speculation, and he does something incredibly bold regarding the Greek philosophy that had permeated the Islamic world.
Right, he looks at the Neoplatonic theory of emanations, which was the dominant way of understanding reality at the time, and he just throws it out completely. He rejects it and moves toward a purer form of Platonism.
And to understand why this is such a radical shift, we have to explore a fascinating cultural contrast regarding how different societies absorb philosophy.
Yeah, the text mentions Los's biographical history of philosophy. Los argued that the Arab world only studied Aristotle because Plato's works weren't properly presented to them.
But that is completely backwards, according to our understanding of the time. The Arab mind was, by its cultural disposition, thoroughly practical. They gravitated toward Aristotle because he was the philosopher of categorization, of tangible ethics, of biology.
The mechanics of the real world?
Exactly. Even if Plato had been presented to them in his true, pure, idealistic light, the practical thinkers of the time would have found his abstract world of forms deeply distasteful.
So Neoplatonism was basically the messy compromise. It tried to combine Plato's mystical, unified ideas with Aristotle's logical, step-by-step frameworks.
Right. It introduced emanations, this idea that reality cascades down from a perfect God in complex stepped layers like water overflowing from a fountain into a series of lower bowls.
A way to explain how a perfect God could create a messy material world without directly touching it.
Precisely. And Mulahadi, representing the highly idealistic Persian mind, looks at that fountain of emanations, all those complex middle steps, and says, no, that's unnecessary.
He bypasses the middleman. He recognizes no emanations at all and goes straight for the pure Platonic conception of the real.
And this specific intellectual pivot brings up one of the most profound sociological observations about human thought. What happens to a culture's philosophical speculation when physical science either doesn't exist or simply isn't studied?
This is such a crucial concept. If you don't have a robust framework of physical science, philosophical speculation is inevitably absorbed by religion.
It's an unavoidable mechanism of the human intellect. The mind demands to know why things happen. It demands a concept of cause and effect.
In a scientifically literate society, cause means the sum of physical conditions, right? You drop a glass, it shatters. The cause is gravity, the atomic structure of the glass, the hard floor.
But if you live in a society that hasn't developed the physics of gravity, you still see the glass shatter. You still demand an explanation. You still have a metaphysical idea of a cause.
And without science, that abstract metaphysical cause must inevitably transform into personal will.
Exactly. It becomes a religious cause. If you have no concept of atmospheric pressure or electricity, but you see lightning strike a tree, you have to explain it.
You know there is a cause.
But lacking the physics, you inevitably invent Zeus. You invent a personal divine will hurling a thunderbolt. The intellect builds the most robust explanation it can using the tools available. If the tools of science are absent, theology is the only tool set left.
So all of these brilliant Persian philosophies historically ended in religion because they were applying staggering intellectual horsepower in a complete vacuum of physical science.
Yes. And keeping that cultural context in mind, we can look at the actual universe that Mullah Hadi built, because he constructs a dizzyingly complex physics of reality based entirely on pure logic and three original principles: the real light, the shadow, and the not real darkness.
Let's start with the first one, the real light. He defines this as absolute, necessary, and absolutely good. And he says it is the ultimate operator that actualizes potential.
Right, because every single thing in the universe exists as pure potential before it actually happens. A seed has the potential to be a tree, but how does that potential become actual?
Well, Hadi uses a fascinating logical proof here.
He does. He says, look at pure potentiality. Before something is actualized, its chances of existing or not existing are exactly equal. It sits at a 50-50 probability.
So what tips the scales? What pushes it from maybe existing to definitely existing?
Hadi argues that whatever is doing the actualizing, whatever tips those scales, cannot itself be non-existence, because non-existence operating on non-existence cannot produce actuality. 0 multiplied by 0 will always remain 0.
Right, you can't build a physical house out of thin air using nothing as a hammer.
Therefore, the operator that forces potential into actuality must inherently exist. It is the absolute necessary light that shines upon potential and makes it real.
And he doesn't just stop there. He mathematically tries to prove that this real light must be completely singular. There can only be one creator. And this is where his lack of physical science leads him into this incredibly creative, albeit flawed, logical trap about vacuums.
Oh, it is a stunning piece of deductive reasoning. He wants to prove why there cannot be two reals, two creators. He argues that if there were a plurality of creators, that would necessarily mean a plurality of worlds. Two creators would mean two separate universes.
And here is his geometrical proof. If you have multiple worlds, they would have to be circular or spherical. And if they exist alongside each other, they would be touching each other. Think of two giant bubbles sitting in a sink.
And if you have two spheres touching each other, what happens at the curves?
There's empty space between them, a gap, a vacuum. But Hadi declares, as an absolutely fundamental rule of his ancient physics, that a vacuum is completely impossible. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Therefore, because a vacuum cannot exist, multiple touching worlds cannot exist. And if multiple worlds can exist, multiple creators cannot exist. The real is purely one.
Okay, but I have to push back here. We have modern vacuum chambers. We build vacuums in laboratories every day. Space is largely a vacuum. Does that mean Hadi's entire proof of monotheism collapses the second you introduce modern physics?
Well, from a purely modern empirical standpoint, yes, the physics underlying his premise is completely wrong. but you have to admire the internal consistency of his logic. Given the accepted axioms of his time that empty space was an ontological impossibility, his deduction is flawless. He is using ancient geometry and primitive physics to prove monotheism.
That's true. But it leads to an obvious question. If there's only one singular blinding real light, why don't we see it? I look around and I see trees, cars, animals, millions of separate things. How does Hadi explain the massive, visible multiplicity of the world if reality is just one pure light?
This is where his concepts of the shadow and the not real darkness come in. He argues that unity does not mean oneness in a boring, uniform, featureless way. The visible many that we see is nothing more than a manifestation of the various attributes of the single real.
Visible multiplicity is just reality unfolded.
Exactly.
And he illustrates this by quoting the poet Jamie, which gives us one of the most brilliant visual metaphors for this kind of philosophy. Jamie says, "The ideas are glasses of various colors in which the sun of reality reflects itself and makes itself visible through them according as they are red, yellow, or blue."
The sun is the one necessary real light. It never changes. It is blindingly white and singular. But the ideas, the potential forms of existence, the concepts of a tree, a human, a mountain, are like intricate stained glass windows.
We think the world is a million different things. We point to the red light on the floor and say, that is a red thing, and point to the blue light and say, that is a completely separate blue thing.
Right.
But Hadi is saying we are just wearing kaleidoscopic glasses. We're looking at one single, unchanging light, filtered through the shadow of different attributes. Multiplicity is just an optical illusion of the soul.
And Mullah Hadi applies this exact same rigorous logical dissection to the human mind itself. He turns his philosophical lens inward, breaking down psychology with the precision of a watchmaker.
It's so meticulous.
He starts by classifying the soul into branches, heavenly and earthly. The earthly soul splits into vegetative, animal, and human powers.
The vegetative powers are just basic biology preserving the individual, digestion, growth.
Yeah.
But the animal soul is where he locates the powers of motion and perception, the senses, and he maps these out into external senses and internal senses.
And his theories on the external senses, taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight, are heavily analytical and sometimes wildly counterintuitive to how we understand biology today. Take his theory on hearing. Hadi insists that sound exists entirely outside the ear,
Which flies in the face of how we usually think about it. We think sound is a vibration that hits our eardrum and is translated inside our head. But Hadi's logic is fascinating. He argues that if sound existed purely inside the ear, it would be impossible for us to perceive its direction and distance.
Because if the sound of a wolf howling is just a phenomenon happening inside the closed caverns of your skull, how could you possibly know the wolf is a mile away to your left? For spatial awareness to work, Hadi argues, the sensory object must exist out there in the world, distinct from the perceiver.
He also creates a hierarchy of these senses, declaring sight as the absolute pinnacle. He argues it is superior because it perceives light, which ties back to his whole universe being built on the real light.
And his most metaphysical reason is that visual things actually exist, whereas sounds resemble non-existence. They are transient, fleeting echoes, while a mountain has a robust, enduring reality.
But the external senses are just the scouts. Where Hadi's genius really shines is how he maps the 5 internal senses, the inner machinery that processes this data.
He calls the first internal sense the common sense, and he uses an amazing metaphor for it. He calls it the prime minister of the mind.
The prime minister.
Yes, the prime minister sits in the capital city of your brain and sends out 5 spies, the 5 external senses, to bring in news from the outside world.
And the spies are incapable of understanding each other. The eye brings back the report white. The tongue brings back the report sweet. But the eye doesn't taste, and the tongue doesn't see. So when you look at a sugar cube and say, this white thing is sweet, who is making that connection?
The prime minister. The common sense receives the separate reports from the spies and decides that both attributes exist in the exact same object.
And he proves this prime minister must exist using the example of a falling drop of water.
Oh, this is a brilliant example.
When a raindrop falls, your physical eye only sees a single round drop at different isolated points in space. But what do we actually perceive when we watch rain? We see a streak, a line of water.
Because the physical eye cannot see a line. A line implies duration across time, and the eye only takes instantaneous snapshots. To account for the phenomenon of seeing a streak of rain, Hadi argues it is absolutely logically necessary to postulate an internal sense that perceives the lengthening of the falling drop.
The common sense is the film editor stitching the snapshots together into a continuous movie.
Exactly. Visual persistence mapped out through philosophy. Then the second internal sense is the preserving faculty, which is basically the filing cabinet. It holds the image steady so the prime minister can actually make a judgment about it.
But the third internal sense is my absolute favorite, the power which perceives individual ideas. This is instinctual judgment.
Hadi contrasts a sheep and a moth to explain this. When a sheep sees a wolf, the eye just sees gray fur and sharp teeth. The prime minister processes the shape and color. But it is this third internal power that perceives the invisible, non-physical idea of enmity.
The sheep doesn't need to reason it out. It instantly knows the wolf is dangerous and runs.
But the moth lacks this specific instinctual judgment. When a moth sees a candle flame, it perceives the light and the shape, but it doesn't perceive the enmity of the fire. It doesn't recognize the danger, so it hurls itself into the flame.
Wow. And the fourth internal sense is memory, which preserves those invisible ideas just as the second sense preserves physical images. And finally, the fifth is the combining power, the ability to combine the image of a man and the idea of wings to conceive of an angel.
This exhaustive, mechanical categorization of the soul is brilliant, but it leads to a massive philosophical wall. Mullah Hadi has mapped out all this earthly, animal machinery of the mind. But what about the human spirit? The thing that makes us divine? What happens to this brilliantly complex mind when the body physically dies?
Hadi states that the human spirit is a unity, distinguishing us from animals. And crucially, it is non-temporal and non-spatial. It did not exist in physical space or time.
Which means it is a changeless shadow of the absolute light. And because it doesn't belong to the spatial world, it has no permanent, necessary relation to the physical body.
He proves this by looking at how we sleep. In waking life, the spirit uses your flesh and blood body. But in our dreams, we walk, we talk, we experience entirely different worlds. Hadi argues the spirit is using an ideal body during sleep. It functions just like the physical body, but isn't made of matter.
Right, and if the spirit can use a physical body when awake and a completely different ideal body when asleep, it logically follows that the spirit actually stands in need of neither. It uses them as vehicles, but is entirely independent of them.
So it is immortal. Hadi violently refutes Plato's idea of reincarnation, the idea that the soul just bounces into a new physical body after death. He says the spirit's entire goal is to reach its original home, the absolute light.
It does this by ascending through theoretical reason and practical purification until it achieves union with God.
But here's where the entire perfectly ordered system threatens to collapse under its own weight, the paradox of free will. If the universe is an emanation of one pure, perfectly good, real light, and our spirit is just a shadow of that light trying to return to it, where does evil come from?
Are we actually making choices or just acting out a predetermined script?
Hadi fiercely criticizes the rationalists of his time for their answer to this. The rationalists argued that to preserve free will, man must be an independent creator of his own actions, including his evil actions. Hadi accuses them of veiled dualism.
He is basically telling them, you are sneaking the ancient Persian light versus darkness war in through the back door. By saying man creates evil, you are setting up man as a rival creator to God. For Hadi, the real is the only creator.
So how does he solve it? He claims that every single object in existence has a bright side and a dark side. All good flows from the side of light, and all evil proceeds from the shadow of non-existence. And then he lands on this staggering, contradictory conclusion.
Right.
He says man, therefore, is both free and determined.
Both free and determined. He summarizes this dizzying concept by saying the spirit is in itself non-existent, but existent in the eternal friend. How wonderful that it is and is not at the same time.
So what does this all mean? I have to be honest. If I'm a Persian citizen living in the 18th or 19th century, this doesn't help me live my life. How wonderful that we are and are not at the same time. That is a beautiful meditation for a philosopher sitting in a quiet room, but it is practically useless for running a society.
Completely useless.
You can't govern people or reform corrupt laws or build a future on a paradox.
And that frustration is exactly the catalyst for what happens next. The deep dive takes a massive turn here, moving from purely abstract philosophy into religious and political revolution. The Persian mind had been trapped in this stasis of beautiful paradoxes. They needed a practical way out.
All these lines of thought, Mullah Sadr's monism, Hadi's light, the debates over the spirit, they all violently crash into reality in the 19th century with the birth of Babism.
Founded by a young visionary from Shiraz named Mirza Ali Muhammad Bab, born in 1820. But Babism didn't just appear out of a vacuum. It evolved out of a highly specific sect within Shia Islam called the Shaykhis.
And the Shaykhis were founded by Sheikh Ahmad, who happened to be a massive fanatic of Vola Sadra. He wrote commentaries on Sadra's philosophy. So that wild idea of subject-object identity, that the knower and the known are one, is baked right into the DNA of the Shaykhis.
The defining theological difference of the Shaykhi sect was their belief in the absolute necessity of an ever-present medium. In mainstream Shia theology, there is an expectation of the return of the absent 12th Imam, the ultimate head of the church.
But the Shaykhis believed that the world could not function without a living medium connecting the church on earth to this absent Imam.
Sheikh Ahmad claimed to be this medium. When he died, Haji Kazim took over the role, and when Haji Kazim died, the sect was in crisis, waiting for a new medium. That is when Mirza Ali Muhammad, who had attended Haji Kazim's lectures, steps forward and proclaims himself the Bab the Gate, the expected medium.
But the Bab didn't just take the title. He weaponized the philosophy underlying it. He took Mulla Sadra's abstract logic and pushed it into radical mathematical new territory. He built a philosophical logic chain that is just breathtaking in its audacity.
Let's walk through this philosophical math, because this is how you turn an abstract idea into a revolution. The Bab starts with the ultimate essence of reality. He says this essence brooks absolutely no distinction between substance and attribute. They are perfectly one.
Okay, step one. The ultimate essence executes its first self-expansion. It expresses itself. And that first expression is existence.
Step two, the Bab states that existence is exactly the same as the known. If something exists, it is capable of being known.
Makes sense. Step three, drawing directly on Mulla Sadra's identity of the subject and the object. The Bab says that if the known and the knower are identical, then the known is the absolute essence of knowledge. Existence equals knowledge.
Yeah, here is where he makes the radical leap. Step four, he says knowledge is will.
Wait, why does knowledge equal will?
Because in a pure, unified, divine state, to fully comprehend something is to intend it. There is no gap, no hesitation between realizing a truth and actualizing it. To know perfectly is to will perfectly.
Okay, wow. And the final step of the math, will, is love.
From Mulla Sadra's dry, logical identity of the knower and the known, the Bab mathematically arrives at the conception of the real as primal love. This love is the absolute essence of reality.
Therefore, the universe isn't a mechanical clockwork. It isn't an arbitrary test of obedience designed by a stern dictator. The universe exists purely because love inherently, joyfully expands.
And this philosophical conclusion leads to an incredibly dangerous theological shift. For the Bab, the word creation no longer means a distant God creating something out of nothing. It means self-manifestation.
The Babists actually argue that the title creator is not exclusively applicable to God alone. They said in a Quranic verse, God is the best of creators, to argue that the superlative best implies the existence of other self-manifesting beings, other creators.
In a deeply orthodox authoritarian society, standing up and implying that human beings share in the divine attribute of creation is a death sentence. It is no wonder that orthodox persecutions rapidly escalated. Babism was breaking away from traditional Islam into its own entirely new, fiercely independent framework.
And the Persian authorities did execute the Bab. But executing the man didn't kill math. After his death, his disciple Baha'u'llah, who was part of a core group called the First Unity, stepped forward to systematize the Bab's wildly mystical ideas into a coherent worldview.
Baha'u'llah claimed to be the ultimate manifestation that the Bab had predicted. He matured the philosophy, he stripped away the literalistic mysticism, he argued that absolute reality is not a person, it is an eternal, living essence. We only apply human words like truth and love to this essence because we are trying to describe the infinite with finite vocabulary.
Baha'u'llah's system is frequently compared to modern Western philosophy, particularly the Hegelian absolute. The living essence manifests itself through the universe with one specific goal: to create atoms or centers of consciousness within itself. The universe is the essence, attempting to experience its own love.
What's fascinating here is that in every single center of consciousness, in every human being, there is a hidden ray of the absolute light, a hidden ray of eternal love. And the entire purpose of life is for the spirit to gradually actualize this hidden ray.
And how does it actualize it? By coming into contact with matter, by engaging with the physical world. The material world isn't an evil trap. and it isn't an illusion to be escaped.
It is the necessary friction required to strike the match. You need the individualizing principle of matter to discover the emotional and intellectual possibilities hidden inside you.
This creates a stark, fascinating contrast with other major philosophical systems. Look at the difference between Baha'u'llah and Buddhism. Both systems agree that after death, our thoughts and characters persist, waiting for another physical opportunity.
But their goals are exact opposites. For the Buddha, salvation is a process of destruction. It consists of starving out the mind atoms by entirely extinguishing desire. Nirvana is the blowing out of the candle. You stop wanting, you stop striving, you cease.
But for Baha'u'llah, salvation's discovery is finding that essence of love hidden inside your consciousness and letting it expand. It's not about blowing the candle out. It's about making it burn so brightly that it rejoins the sun.
That optimism becomes even more profound when we compare Baha'u'llah to the famously pessimistic German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Both Baha'u'llah and Schopenhauer conceived of reality as being driven by a fundamental, inescapable force present in every atom. Schopenhauer called it the primordial will. Baha'u'llah calls it love.
They are looking at the exact same driving force in the universe, but Schopenhauer believed this will was driven by a sinful bent. An inexplicable, eternal, evil inclination that just constantly forces us to blindly objectify and suffer. It's like a parasite driven by blind, agonizing hunger.
Whereas Baha'u'llah looks at that same striving, expanding force and says the cause of it is the joy of self-expansion. It is like an artist driven by the absolute thrill of creation. It is conscious and it's fundamentally good.
This framework completely redefines what a human being actually is. Baha'u'llah argues that the essence of man is not reason. It is not our intellect or our self-consciousness. The true essence of man is this ray of love. It is the source of all impulse toward noble and unselfish action.
And here the ghost of Mullah Sadra returns. Because reason is viewed merely as an evolutionary tool. It is not a necessary condition for immortality. In Baha'u'llah's system, every form of life has this immortal spiritual part.
It is the ultimate democratization of the soul. You don't have to be an elite philosopher who understands the prime minister of the mind to be immortal. You don't have to possess a brilliant intellect. You simply survive death by virtue of existing as a spark of the real light.
We have traveled a massive historical and intellectual distance today. From the Tartar invasions crushing all thought and enforcing blunt utility, through centuries of solitary scholars arguing over optics, vacuums, and the identity of the knower and the known, to an unstoppable political movement based on the metaphysics of primal love.
The conclusion of this journey provides a perfect synthesis of the entire Persian intellectual struggle. For centuries, the Persian mind grappled with the problem of diversity. Why is the world so messy and plural? And they bounced between extremes trying to solve it.
They started with ancient Magian dualism, Zoroaster, and Mani. They had two active primary spirits fighting it out. Naked dualism. It was highly objective and materialistic, but it completely lacked analytical depth.
Then Islam arrived, bringing fierce monotheism, and Greek philosophy was injected, providing analytical tools. But this new mixture pushed the Persian mind too far in the opposite direction. It roused their slumbering subjectivity, and they swung into extreme pantheism.
The Sufis claimed the physical world was just an illusion, a mirror for God.
Right. They bounced from the stark physical warfare of light and dark to the dreamy, subjective illusion of the Sufis, to the dizzying, paralyzing paradoxes of Mullah Hadi.
But all of this abstract wandering finally landed back on Earth. Babism synthesized all these inherited philosophical tendencies. It took the profound, unified vision of reality that the philosophers had built in the clouds, stripped away the dreamy mysticism, and weaponized it as a practical, moral imperative.
It roused the Persian spirit to a consciousness of the stern reality of things. Metaphysics eventually becomes ethics, and ethics eventually becomes politics. Even though the Babist movement was cosmopolitan, its practical, unmystic tone served as a remote yet vital cause of actual political reform in Persia.
The way a culture defines reality inevitably dictates how it governs itself. Consider your own daily life. Think about the political landscape you live in right now. It is so easy to assume that the way things are is just based on modern economics or recent events.
But how much of our modern world is secretly governed by abstract philosophical arguments made centuries ago by people whose names we've forgotten?
The concepts of human rights, of individuality, of equality, these ideas we take for granted today were once radical, dangerous theories argued over by exiled thinkers trying to figure out if the universe was made of light or shadow.
And that leaves us with a fascinating, lingering question. built directly on our exploration of science and religion. We saw that for Mulahadi, a society without physical science inevitably absorbs its philosophy into religion.
Hmm?
The question of why a glass shatters becomes a question of who shattered it. God fills the void of physics.
Right.
But what happens to a modern society like ours where physical science exhaustively answers how the atoms split, how the gravity pulls, but completely abandons the why? When science explains the mechanics of the universe but offers no inherent meaning, do we invent new secular philosophical religions to fill that agonizing gap, or do we just slowly, collectively stop asking the question altogether?
Man, that is a heavy one to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those questions, keep challenging the mechanics of reality, and keep looking at the world through your own beautifully colored glasses of multiplicity. We will catch you next time.